during the crucifixion. There is a lot of controversy about what happened when. Because, as we will see sometime during the class, we'll see what appear to be conflicting stories or things that appear to be out of time. So we're going to have to struggle with the idea of what was the purpose of the author of that particular gospel. I believe that's one of the things that you have to know to figure some of this out. And so knowing that the overall intention was not to provide an hour-by-hour account, we have to go into the text and ferret it out to do that. So that's what we're going to be doing. So you now have that. I would encourage you to... Oh, yeah.
Is this
I
for
would
next
encourage...
week?
Excuse me?
Is this for next week?
This is the whole quarter. We're going to be doing this the whole time because some of this is going to change potentially. Some of it will move around. Some of it will have a different... take one back there too. We'll have... we might put some things in a different place. And there's the number one person asking about homework. Here we go. I have identified it for you there now. That's what we're working on for the rest of the quarter.
Okay.
Be part of it. That's my initial stab at it. And we're going to be putting things together on that. And then we're going to look at the events themselves. What did they mean? What was going on? How did all this connect? That will be our point. So we have a couple of guys. This is Randy Moore. He's from Richmond. He's visiting with us today. Sir, what's your name?
Linda Eastridge from Ohio. Not local.
Okay. Eastridge. Glad to have you here. Passing through, heading south?
We know the Morrises very well. We came up for door service.
Very good. Very good. What's up, man? Thank you. All right. Let's have prayer and we're ready to go. Thank you, God, for today and the blessing we receive in being together. We're grateful for this study that we can engage. Pray, God, that we will understand, appreciate the events about which we will study during this quarter. Thank you for loving us always through Jesus, in whom we pray. Amen. All right. Let's just look at it here right quick to let you see what I'm putting on the paper for you to consider. The couple of things by reminder. The Passover on the 15th day. That's going to be important for today's class. That the Passover happened on the 15th day. The original day or the original month was called Adar. It is now called Nisan. So, pass that back for me. And so, but that would be important for what we're going to discuss in particular text today. Again, we studied it last week, and it's hard to get our heads around it. It's a very difficult concept, but Passover started 6 p.m. on our Thursday to 6 p.m. on their Friday. So, on our Friday. So, the Jewish time encompassed one day. The Jewish time encompasses 2 days, as we consider it. So just to know that.
You talk about being 6 p.m. It's actually sundown, isn't it? Because it's sundown to
No. If I understand it right, again, we can do some work on this. If I understand it right, it actually started on a particular time, 6 p.m.
I mean, how did they measure time at that point? I mean, they didn't have a watch. I mean, it was all based upon the sun.
All I know is that if that, it could very well be, which would mean it would move, what, 3 hours?
I mean, because every time, as I've I've worked with some teachers, and on their high holidays,
Yeah.
they would always say they have to be home before dark. That's, you know, they would have to leave work so they would be, to be before dark, not a certain time, but before dark. So I think, you know, 6 p.m. for them, or the 6 hour, however they measured it, was just what time it was, hours they didn't have, you know, whatever. It was just where the sun was in relationship to
So, well, that very well may be, and that would make a lot of sense. How would they know then it was the 6th hour?
you know, just based on the position of the sun. And, you know,
But that would be different times of the year, right?
yeah,
That's what I'm saying. It
So
would
the
be,
days would vary if you
Right.
did
like
that.
noon would be where the sun is straight up,
yeah.
you know, and then it would be like, you know, 1/4 and, you know, 1/2 and then 3/4 and full, you know, and it wouldn't necessarily be based upon 60 minutes, it would be based upon
The sun.
the time of the year and where the sun was.
You know, that makes perfect sense to me. All I know is in the writings that I have, what I've been reading, the idea was that there was a set time, but then the events would happen based on the sun. In other words, if the day started at 6 p.m., but the sun didn't go down until 9, then they had that 3-hour window to before dark. That's what I was understanding, because that's what, as far as Passover is concerned.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question.
These people of old,
That's what
like my ancestors, I've seen them tell time by the sun.
Yes.
Just step and hold their hand and then measure where their arm was from the sun, and they were close. So,
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good. It would have to be a sundial would even be based upon the sun, not on the time.
Right.
So it would make sense to me. I guess maybe the way that people have characterized this is to help us get it in our heads what it means. Meaning, their night preceded their day. That's all. For our understanding, their night preceded their day, and our way of doing it would put part of their night
Right.
on our
Their
day.
night
There
preceded
you
their
go.
day, that's the way it works,
That's it.
whereas we started in the middle of the night.
There you go. Right.
Googled.
Okay, good.
For ancient peoples, including the ancient Jews, such precision about time was unknown and to some degree impossible. Surely for them, the measurement of time was of divine origin. God set forth the sun to rule the day, and the moon and the stars the night.
He's getting probably right on that, and that makes perfect sense to me.
I've got a question. You got in this outline here that Passover is the 15th day of the month of Nisan.
Yes.
Always,
Yes.
not always a Friday?
No. Well, let me back up.
Is the 15th day of that month always fall on Friday in the Jewish calendar?
Well,
Is that right?
what I'm wondering is that when God established it with the Jews in the book of Exodus before the final plague, he said on the 15th day of the month. That's what he said. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. So with their months, they would have been always, if their months were of equal number of days, I don't know how they did it, then it would always have fallen on that Friday. But I don't think that was the case that it was. And yet, I know today, obviously, they don't do that. Today, Passover moves.
Yeah,
And
Passover
so-
would move just like
Right.
our calendar, different events come on different days depending on the month and the year.
Right.
But if Passover's gonna be, it said it started on Friday, how did you know that it was on the 15th day of the month fell on Friday every time? How would you know that?
Well, I don't know that, the point being, I don't know that this was, well, that's a good question. All I know is it happened on the 15th day. I didn't research to find out why ours moves around, would theirs be the same, and if it was the same, was it always the Friday versus whatever day the 15th day was? In order for the 15th day to always to be a Friday, then all of their months would have had to have been 28 days to make it happen. And I don't know if that's what they
But
did.
that wouldn't make it happen consistently though, because the 28 days doesn't go into 365.
That's true as well.
Well, their year isn't the same amount of days
Yeah.
either.
Also, they added a year,
Every so often,
yes.
Every so
But
often.
it wasn't a year, a calendar year, it was 400 days, which is what it counted to. But this also says that generally a month was said to begin in the evening of the 29th day at the moment when the thin sliver of the new moon appeared in the sky. When all 7 court members agreed to the new month, it literally began. Fires were lit on the hilltops to announce it. So it was, so they pretty much made it up as they went.
As they went along?
I just want to say, you're doing a fine job with the first 2 lines of this syllabus.
There you go. See, all this stuff, you can be, look, these are good questions that are coming up. These are the things that this class for the quarter can do some research. That's why this is a research class, is what I intended it to be. We can answer some of these things. That's a very good idea. All right.
Well, this Passover is started on Friday in this particular, was that just for the time period we're talking about, or was it all the time?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I know this, at least from the, if not tradition, maybe from the actual case. These are the days we're talking about, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, definitely, in this time period. I'll ask that question of myself later. That's good. I'll go back and look at that. That's good stuff. Now, what I put on here, we started in John 12 and verse 1 when he said 6 days before the Passover. What I put in for you is, here are some events that happened just prior, before those 6 days. Some events that make a point. And I want to look at, you can look at it from Matthew 19 verse 1. He was over, Jesus finished saying these things, departed from Galilee, came to Judea beyond Jordan. That's where he started. And then from that point, after being across the Jordan, now he's going to work his way back toward Jerusalem for the final time. And he talked about these things, and these are the texts that I put in order prior to what John says in John 12 verse 1, and now 6 days before the Passover occurred. So John 12 verse 1, he came to Bethany. So he'd been over on the other side of the Jordan River, and he crossed back over into Palestine, and he came to the city of Bethany. Of course, Bethany, we talked about the last time, is where the anointing with the oil took place. What I found out about that, because that question came up the last time as well, the contradiction, apparent contradiction between 3 accounts that talk about the event of the oil. The accounts in Matthew and Mark say that the woman poured the oil on his feet. John adds that she poured it on his head and then wiped his feet with her hair. When I did some research on that, what I found out was the head was the normal way that it was done. Everyone, when they would offer a gift to honor someone, would always put oil on their hair. I assume that it had to do something partially with cleanliness, but I also think that the point was you honor someone as a person with their head. The significance of the feet was that she was talking about herself, not about him. Meaning, you honored someone by pouring the oil on the head, but then when she used her hair to dry his feet, she was talking about herself. I am your servant. I am at your feet. I am placing myself at your feet. That's what I found out in the literature that I was reading. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And so the event is very important, not only for honoring who Jesus is, but making a statement about who she was in relationship to him. Did anybody else do some work on that? Think about it anymore? If you had any other thoughts about it? Before we move into new material today? Okay. Now, I want to start in John 12, 9 through 11. again, now as we look at the events that are surrounding this time, the next day, a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees, went out to meet him, and cried out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. This event, I should have gone back to verse 9. The Jews, I wanted to start there. The Jews knew he was there. They came not only for Jesus' sake, but they also wanted to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead, so he was like a sideshow, if you will. But they wanted to kill him. They wanted to kill him because of what? Verse 13 or verse 11. They believed. Because he had been raised from the dead, there were people believing, and now they're going to turn against these Jewish leaders. Well, as is the case with those Jewish leaders, oftentimes they did counterattack. And the best way to handle this, just kill Lazarus. Interesting thought to me. If he had been raised, died and been raised, and they kill him, did they not think he could be raised again? The point was, they were just confused. He had them all torn up. And so the whole thing that generated this group of people was not only the feast time, but the news that Jesus was coming, and he had started in Bethany, which is where Lazarus lived, and apparently they're all going to come together. It seems as though, and I didn't even think about this before, I had never thought about it, but it appears that maybe he was there in Bethany seeing Lazarus, and whether or not he came with Jesus to Jerusalem, I don't know. But the group started in Bethany. They knew he was there. This event had happened with the washing of the feet. They knew this was Lazarus' hometown. A great number of people showed up because they wanted to see Lazarus. And then the next day, after that, Jesus comes into Jerusalem. This is called what we call the triumphal entry. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This text is by prophecy. If you go back to Zechariah, the Old Testament, chapter 9 and verse 9, the prophet had said, Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. By prophecy, Jesus was going to come back into Jerusalem because it was the week of the crucifixion. The events of the triumphal entry are these. The people heard about it. They had come to the feast. They also wanted to see Jesus coming. They took palm trees and went out to meet him, and palm branches, and laid them down on the road as a symbol of victory. It is interesting that he rode in on a donkey. When the things that they were doing here, one writer called it spontaneous and organized, which is an interesting way of looking at it. Spontaneous showed up, but it was organized in that God had prophesied it was going to happen. So the things they were doing had a lot to do with honor of a great victor, honor of one who has had a great victory. And yet, when the victor would ride into town, what did they usually ride? What was it? Remember, especially in the Romans?
It was a horse, wasn't it?
Was it a
White
horse?
horse.
White horse.
A white horse. Yeah, the victor would come in on a white horse. Well, Jesus came in lowly. He came in humbly. He came in on a donkey. And yet the people were honoring him in this lowly position. Here's the first thing that I want us to notice about this event. Go back to the time when the Passover was instituted in the book of Exodus. And if you look here, chapter 12 of Exodus, God begins in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. If the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take according to the number of persons." Verse 5, "It shall be without blemish the first year. You can take it from the sheep or the goats, and you keep it put away till the 14th day of the month." That was how their Passover week began. They would go out and pick the lamb, or it could be the kid of the goats if they didn't have a lamb, and they would set it aside, and it would be set aside for the purpose of the sacrifice. Makes sense to me, it appears to me, that the being set aside was not only to say, we've made it, we have set aside, we've made a decision. This is not a last minute thing. Not a last minute, I'm going to do whatever. You know, the difference between when a collection plate is passed and somebody who's already made a decision and somebody who at the last minute goes, oh no. And we've probably all been in that situation before. That's the difference. They set it aside intentionally. It seems to me that the other reason they set it aside was because it had to be without blemish. And so they set it aside so that there would be no chance of damage coming from the rest of the interaction with the other animals. And then it would be set aside and preserved and kept. And so that began the celebration of their Passover. And I want to suggest to you that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, it was for the purpose of saying, I'm set aside. Here I come. It matches the week very well. Jesus is, according to Peter, of course, the unblemished lamb without spot. He is the perfect sacrifice. And this arrival in Jerusalem on the 10th, which is what I think is going on here, on the 10th day of the month, which, based on the time frame that we're using right now, would have been on Sunday. And he arrived that day, 4 days before the time of the eating. And so he's setting himself aside. He is showing to everyone that he is the sacrificial lamb. Now, I don't know if the Jews, obviously, would have recognized it. But there's so much going on in the life of Jesus that there are these little tags that the gospel writers put on it, and they would say things like, the disciples did not realize it until such and such happened, and then they go, oh. I think that this makes sense when the Passover is discussed in a spiritual sense in Placid. I think 1 Corinthians 10 deals with some of this. So the idea was, I think, maybe not while the event was happening, but it seems likely to me that they would look back and remember this event when Jesus had the triumphal entry into Jerusalem and be able to see this as him setting himself aside for the offering and the sacrifice that was going to come. What do you think about that? What thoughts do you have about that particular thing? Anything? Does that make sense to you? That it would work that way?
So, what was termed preparation day, you're saying is Thursday.
Preparation day
They talk about
for the
preparation
Passover, yes.
was Thursday.
I think
Or was
that
that
has to be right. It's
Okay.
the 14th day. not 15th is the Passover day.
Okay,
So
that's a Friday evening.
yes, that would be Friday. And so the preparation day would be Thursday.
I've got this parallel for me. And Matthew said Jesus was riding on a donkey and a colt, and the others just say donkey.
What I think is going on, I read someone who did this. A donkey is what I read. A donkey is not one of the most compliant animals that ever existed. And so to get the donkey to do what they wanted, they took the baby, the colt, and the foal, and led it in front so mom would follow. And that's how he rode into the city. And I think that matches with the accounts that are given in the Gospels. Does that make sense? To me it does. Okay. In fact, if you look at verse 16 of Matthew, or John chapter 12, there are times that I'm using John as a base, and other times I use Mark as a base, and then work the others in. Right now it's John that I'm looking at. Notice verse 16 of John 12. His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written about him, and that they had done these things to him. So, again, the event of him coming in didn't even occur to them that Zechariah 9:9 applied. It occurred to them later when he was glorified. There is, in my mind, a little confusion about when that was. When was he glorified? Well, in his prayer in John 17, he asked for God to give him the glory that he had with him from before the foundation of the world. There's also the idea that he was, and he would say, I think in John 13 or so, he would say, and now I am glorified. Meaning, in that case, now I am here in Jerusalem for the purpose of what I'm here to do. There's also the idea of the glorification that came through the resurrection and the ascension back to heaven. So I don't know when it was. I'm going to suggest that based on these disciples and the kind of men that they seem to be, maybe a lot of this didn't even happen until that Pentecost Sunday.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Because even at the ascension, they were still like, are you going to give us the kingdom?
There you go.
They didn't understand until they got the Holy Spirit.
That's what I'm wondering. That's a good point. And therefore, when he was glorified, may actually have reference to the sermon that Peter preached on that day in Acts 2. That was his crowning glorification, the first sermon that related to him. And therefore, that's when they began to understand these things that they had experienced and seen, but just couldn't or didn't get it. Okay. All right. Now, this event of him coming into Jerusalem, look at Mark chapter 11 and verse 11 to harmonize some things here. Verse 11, Jesus went into Jerusalem and into the temple. So when he looked around at all these things, as the hour was already late, he went down to Bethany with the 12. His coming into Jerusalem appears that he then went to the temple. I think it's fascinating that he looked around at all things. Now, you're going to see, the question of the cleansing of the temple. I have put it here on the next day, Monday. based on Mark 11 in verse 12, or at least that's a reference, because it says, "And the next day he came from Bethany." So there's sometimes when it seems that Mark is probably the one who gives the best account of movement day by day or week by week or something. Mark's number one use of word, most prolific word or concept in the Gospel of Mark, is the word straightway, or immediately, or then. He was constantly going, now we did this, then we did this. His Mark is an account of action, continuous action. Mark, primarily, what do you remember? Mark was written to what audience? Gentile audience, that's right. Yeah, Roman. Gentile Roman audience. And so his thing is about trying to, I think, it seems, Mark is more about the actions to draw their attention to who he is by what he did. You do this, you do this, do this. He's constantly moving and doing. And that would bring attention more to the Gentiles, because they needed to focus on what he was doing, and from that be able maybe to see that he's a different kind of guy. Now Matthew, on the other hand, writes to a Jewish audience. And Matthew's main point is to tell the Jews, he is the king. He is the king. And therefore there are references in Matthew when he's looking at it from the standpoint of he is the ruler. He is the one who is in charge. And therefore they need to see him in that fashion. Luke is a guy who seems to have written to say he is a humble servant. Luke is a doctor. And his writing oftentimes adds details, physical details, that the others don't add because of being a doctor. And he adds those details that he would have seen and would have made sense to him. And so Luke is writing for, remember who he's writing to? Theophilus. And he wrote Acts for the same purpose, right? So it seems, and there's a little bit of discussion there, Theophilus is simply a word, it could be a noun or a name of a man named Theophilus. Some want to say that it means a God lover, which is what it means. And so he's writing to anybody who loves God. I don't believe that. I think he's writing to his friend, who is likely a Roman, a Gentile, could be a proselyte, could be one interested in, maybe he is a Gentile who's heard all this stuff and he's inquisitive, he's asking questions. And so Luke is writing to give him details about things.
That's why Luke cares about accuracy.
Yep.
That's what you're saying, talking about details. It's very detail oriented, whereas some of the other writers are not.
Very good. In fact, there is William Ramsey is a scholar from the 1800s who decided that he'd had enough of this thing with people believing in Scripture. And he said, I'm going to show you that you guys are just messed up. And he was a scientist, an archaeologist. And so he took Acts. He took Luke's account of Acts, talking about details. And he said, I am going to follow the path that Luke lays out in this Acts account. And I'm going to judge it based on the details. And when he finished that study, he actually had converted himself. And he ended up writing a series of about 8 or 9 books I have in my office, where he then says, I was wrong. This is the best historical and accurate record that there is. And one of the things that he uses to say, to Sasha's point, he says, when Luke says that we went up to Jerusalem, when they were in the north, is because Jerusalem was a higher elevation. And he was careful enough in detail to be accurate in that way. even though the general way is to say, if you're in the north and you're going down to Jerusalem. But Luke consistently in his writing got it right on elevations, got it right on roads and towns, and that was a conversion thing for Rembrandt.
When did the tradition of north being up and south being down start? It probably was after that period.
Well, it may very well have been. I mean, it would make sense that it would be later. I don't know. You know, we think of those people as sometimes less intelligent than we, and yet sometimes they seem to be more intelligent than we have become in our technology age.
I'm just thinking that if somebody's interpreting
Yep.
that north means up or up means north, that may not have happened as a tradition until after.
You may be right. You may be right.
That's accurate. And also that time period in that worldview, Jerusalem was the center. It
Yep.
wasn't like, you know, the way we see a map these days.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just like similar to the Arabs, you know, Mecca was faced towards Mecca.
There you go.
If you look at maps up till about the 1600s, it's whichever way you approach something from. It wasn't till after sometime in 15 or 1600s that maps always put north up.
Right.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
But if you look at some of the maps, you see, I picked this up from Antiques Roadshow. But
Yeah, oh, okay.
where they're showing how a ship would approach the shore, and it was always the way the ship came in was up.
How they drew the map.
Yeah.
So
Until
if the ship was
sometime
coming-
later when the north finally became up.
So if the ship was coming west to east, they would draw the map like this.
Yeah.
Did not know that. Maybe I should be watching that show, Antique Roadshow.
Because quite often they'll point that out on that show for an old map.
I would never have known that. Now, here's another point that I want to bring out from this verse 11 in Mark 11. Now, I had not realized this at all until this week in looking at this. And it has helped me to get a better handle on what appears to be some discrepancies between the accounts. I don't know that there's a clear statement about this. However, you add 2 or 3 and it makes pretty good sense. He makes it here clearly in this verse that he went out to Bethany. Well, let's say that he came into Jerusalem on Sunday. There's the triumphal entry. He went in the temple and he looked around. When it was late, he then turned and they went back out to Bethany. And then the next day he comes back in. So basically he spent Sunday night in Bethany. Now here is what one person revealed. It makes sense to me. He went to Bethany each night and then came back into town. So at night, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, he left, went out to Bethany, and came back. And that helps to account for some things that go on, knowing that he was going in and out all of the time, not just hanging around in Jerusalem. But he was, and so when you see him going to Bethany and coming back, and you're thinking, now wait a minute, he was already in Bethany on Sunday, or Sunday night, so now it's Tuesday night. Well, maybe this event ought to have been on Sunday night, when in fact, it seems to clarify things better to see that he went back to stay with his friends in Bethany and then come back in the next day every time. And I think that helps in some of this.
The distance to Bethany was,
You know,
was it 8 miles?
it was a few miles. Does anyone have, check it right quick, somebody, I can't remember. I saw it once, but I don't remember the distance.
Couple hour walk.
My map doesn't,
Not very far.
my maps.
Not very far.
Well, it's not far, but my maps are gone from the back. This is the Bible split. I'm waiting on a good woman to fix my Bible sometime.
What is the distance from Jerusalem?
Anybody see it? Anybody notice it? Does anybody have a,
Bethany, Louisville is about 6,000.
Go ahead, that's fine. Better town left, that,
Heard voices.
what?
1.5 miles.
How much?
1.5.
1.5 to Bethel. So,
So it's a suburb.
yeah, it's a suburb, absolutely. So for our purposes, it would be like
Half hour
us
walk.
every day walking from here to downtown. It's 1 mile to the bypass from here, so another half mile up every day. That's not terrible. Not terrible at all. But it does help, I think, to fit some things together. So
You
what I'm
probably
gonna
do a lot
ask,
of shopping on the way.
yeah, if you do that, yeah.
Stop at McDonald's.
Just as much shopping as there is between here and the bypass.
There's a little bit.
Is there?
Depends if we stop off at Ollie's or not. Ace Hardware's right up there.
Salvation Army.
Yeah. That's
They're
not
all
East
on the
Hardware now.
bypass.
Did they move it?
Yeah, it's gone. It's around a ways. All right, so,
Goodwill.
what I want you to do is to take this and help me. Go back in and see if it makes sense to you that some of these things connect in the way that they do. I'm still not finished with it down at the bottom, of course. I've only got through Wednesday, but I'm still working on that, so. All right?
Football knees, couldn't hardly make it. Oh, thank you so much.
I was actually born in Ohio, and I don't get to Ohio very much, so.
Right here, buddy.
About 60 miles north of Dayton.
My name's Dave from
Farm country. St. Mary.
A lot of agriculture over there.
Yes.